It's hard to believe that SpongeBob SquarePants first aired 20 years ago, changing TV forever for the weirder. The premise of a sponge who works at a crab run burger joint in an underwater town called Bikini Bottom alongside a starfish, underwater breathing squirrel, and clarinet playing squid was way more bizarre than arguably any kid show before it. Join Screen Rant as we count down the 25 weirdest moments from this wacky TV favorite. Surely one of the most bizarre moments in SpongeBob history has to be the ending of the episode I Had an Accident. After SpongeBob is traumatized by a sandboarding accident, he becomes a hermit, intent on spending the rest of his days inside. Sandy spends much of the episode trying to get him outside, finally culminating in her having Patrick dress up as a gorilla and attacking her just outside SpongeBob's door. When another Patrick shows up to the scene, Sandy and SpongeBob are both startled and confused by who it could be. This alternate Patrick unzips himself to reveal himself as an actual gorilla, or more accurately, a green screen human in a goofy looking gorilla suit, and then starts attacking Patrick and Sandy. It only gets weirder from there. When SpongeBob asks how a gorilla can exist underwater, he suddenly speaks English and tries to explain, before abruptly shouting, "George, they're onto us!" rips SpongeBob in half and then rides off on a zebra? One of the most famously bizarre episodes of SpongeBob is Frankendoodle, in which the pencil used to draw the characters suddenly drops from the sky in between SpongeBob and Patrick. To their delight, they find that everything they draw with the pencil comes to life. SpongeBob creates a doodle version of himself, which he affectionately names Doodlebob. Doodlebob promptly comes to terrorize his maker, however, attempting to erase him from the world so that he might take his place.
You doodle, me SpongeBob!
Spongehenge is surely one of the series' weirdest episodes overall. In it, we watch SpongeBob take refuge in a cave after being chased down there by jellyfish in a deadly windstorm. He slowly starts to lose his mind in here as he holes himself up away from these dreaded creatures. He starts to lose himself, talking to his own reflection in a shiny rock in the cave. Eventually, he goes totally bonkers and begins to carve a real mirror image statue of himself from the same rock. Before he knows it, he is talking to this rock version of himself. In the same episode, SpongeBob eventually comes to make a number of these sponge statues and realizes that when all placed together in a circle, they form a lovely harmony that jellyfish from all over adore. This new monument comes to be known as Spongehenge. If the premise of designing musical sponge statues to appease jellyfish isn't a weird enough premise to digest in itself, a flash forward jumps ahead 3,000 years later as a fleet of three-eyed aliens float around Spongehenge, explaining that no one knows the monument's origins but that it causes the migration of jellyfish. In the season 9 episode, Salsa Imbecilius, the show makes a big show of Patrick's dumbness. Plankton discovers he can make idiot sauce, or Salsa Imbecilius, by adding Patrick's saliva as an ingredient. He plans to give it to Mr. Krabs in the hopes of obtaining the secret formula, but when the sauce flows out the chimney and gets absorbed into a nearby rain cloud, it pours all over Bikini Bottom. The only ones not affected by the sauce are only able to get everyone back to normal by teaching them an entire university education. When Mr. Krabs, famous for his money-hungry ways, gets condemned to be generous for the rest of his life. After Mr. Krabs desperately tries to sell a stash of rotten Krabby Patties to his customers, he loses a ton of business. He also ends up in the hospital when he eats one himself. The Flying Dutchman traps him in Davy Jones' locker and condemns him to be generous from then on out. Fans were then treated to the better part of an episode watching Krabs behave uncharacteristically open-handed. Another weird moment for the series centers on SpongeBob falling in love with a rotten patty that all of his customers reject. Sometimes the wackiness of the SpongeBob series can be seen not in characters defying their usual personalities, but in the extent to which they will take characters' already weird personalities. Fans will be familiar with the overenthusiastic, workaholic way that SpongeBob approaches his job at the Krusty Krab. But this episode takes it memorably far, showing SpongeBob take the burger out on a date and then sing it a long romantic ballad that takes up much of the episode. The usually super sarcastic, cynical Squidward experiences a head injury and suddenly comes to think of himself as a newborn baby. The doctor pronounces that Squidward is afflicted with a condition called head-go-boom-boomitis and charges SpongeBob and Patrick with taking care of him. It is beyond bizarre to see these two usually infantile characters be given the role of caregiver to someone like Squidward. It's not until he falls into an ice machine that Squidward is returned suddenly to his usual self. Squidward accidentally locks himself in a walk-in freezer at the Krusty Krab after desperately trying to find a place to play his clarinet in solitude away from SpongeBob. When he can't get out, he ends up being frozen for 2,000 years. Much to Squidward's despair, it's the futuristic Spongetron who rescues him, a SpongeBob-esque cyborg who is only one of 486 clones. This is as weird an idea for fans as it is dreadful for Squidward. Of course, Squidward desperately wishes to return to his own time when he learns of the 486 SpongeBobs compared to his time's just one, so they point him to a nearby time machine, which ends up taking him too far into the past. Here, he encounters a caveman-esque SpongeBob and Patrick, whose memeably goofy illustration and primitive rage at Squidward's clarinet playing are both memorably weirder than usual aspects to an overall weirder than usual episode. The weird moments for this episode don't stop there. Squidward barely makes it back to the time machine, but when he does, he finds he can't control it and ends up crashing in a mysterious dimension of pure emptiness. He wanders around, at first claiming to be glad that he finally reached a quiet place to play his clarinet, but slowly becomes tormented by the sound of the mysterious voices that populate this realm, who keep repeating the word alone without stop. Squidward's existentialist break is definitely one of the most absurd moments of the series. Another episode with a dark, absurdist tone is the famous Squidward in Clarinet Land of Season 7. Squidward discovers a secret door in the storage locker at the Krusty Krab, entering a mysterious forest made of clarinets. There is an ominous, extremely creepy severed eagle head there that greets him.
I am the keeper of the Horned Forest. State your business here.
And tells him he has come to teach him how to grant peace to clarinets and to learn that they cannot be owned. When Squidward, understandably terrified, claims to know how to respect clarinets, the so-called keeper doesn't believe him and swallows him. The super weird story continues in this episode when, after being swallowed, Squidward finds himself desperately chasing SpongeBob for his clarinet, eventually running him into a giant pinball machine. He encounters a giant version of Patrick here, who insists that it's the pressure that is doing all this to Squidward. SpongeBob's maniacal laughter and some frantic-sounding piano plays on as giant Patrick repeats again and again the pressure. Squidward suddenly is sucked up through a vacuum, and SpongeBob and him are cast out of Bikini Bottom, off the Earth, into space. SpongeBob and Patrick get stuck in Rock Bottom after accidentally boarding the wrong bus home from Glove World. They find themselves in this spooky, depressive town at the bottom of a cliff, populated by the unsavory, weird-looking creatures of the deep sea. The city's lights shut off after a point, and the bus driver leaves, leaving SpongeBob in darkness. It's only after a creepy anglerfish helps SpongeBob that he is able to get home. Rock Bottom is not the only episode to take place in a weird, stranded location. In To Save a Squirrel from Season 5, SpongeBob and Patrick end up stranded in a creepy forest after trying to sneak away to camp with Sandy and her luggage. After sneaking into a cave, they end up meeting an old man who claims to have been stranded there for 40 years. Eventually, the old man convinces the two of them that they want to eat one another, and that one of them will have to do it first to save themselves. This culminates in them attempting to eat one another, which impresses the old man so much that he reveals that he was Sandy all along. Suddenly, both of them get the urge to eat Sandy too. And this dark, weird survivalist episode closes with her saying, "Next time, I'll bring more granola." One wacky episode is Pizza Delivery, in which Squidward and SpongeBob are picked up by a tornado and left stranded far from Bikini Bottom. The Krusty Krab doesn't serve pizza, of course, but Mr. Krabs can hardly turn down a chance to make some extra cash and insists that the two of them go deliver a disassembled Krabby Patty if the idea of two of them delivering a Krusty Krab pizza, especially given how much Squidward hates having to do anything with SpongeBob, isn't weird enough. Maybe the most absurd part of the episode is when the characters realize they really haven't been stranded at all. The Krusty Krab was just behind them. One of the weirdest role reversals for the series happens between Mr. Krabs and Plankton. The episode opens with Plankton plotting his usual plot to steal the Krabby Patty's secret formula, lamenting that he can't just switch lives with Mr. Krabs. Karen reminds him that he conveniently happens to have a machine that does just that. For the rest of the episode, fans watch Plankton take the role of Mr. Krabs, celebrating his newfound power and wealth. Surely the weirdest part of this, though, is when Mr. Krabs busts into the Krusty Krab completely naked, having taken on Plankton's role. This list would not be complete without some exploration of the wacky animation style used on the show. One example of the pure absurdity that the illustration of the characters sometimes take can be seen in the episode Muscle Bob Buff Pants, wherein SpongeBob becomes a ripped bodybuilder after developing a sudden obsession with making himself large and wide. SpongeBob fools everyone into believing him, but his newfound musculature is really just a result of him puffing air into his spongy arms. But he manages to convince everyone that he's gotten jacked from doing armpit farts. The show SpongeBob SquarePants is of course known for the super wacky animation style it has, often bordering on the absurd. This is especially the case in the illustration of its characters. SpongeBob and Patrick have their faces freeze on them after doing too many silly faces at each other. They get their faces massaged, but this just makes them extremely droopy and just as ridiculous looking, if not more than before. The silly faces in this episode are some of the weirdest animation you could ever hope to see. This is surely one of the weirdest episodes of the show. SpongeBob and Patrick find themselves attracted to a new toy called the Whirly Brain, advertised to them on TV, which involves detaching one's brain from one's head with a motorized propeller. If that isn't weird enough, they eventually end up literally losing their minds when they accidentally drop them off in an old man's backyard. If you're itching to know one of the ickiest of the show's weird moments, look no further than the Season 5 episode, Fungus Among Us, in which SpongeBob spreads an itchy fungus around Bikini Bottom. When SpongeBob accidentally picks up some sea fungus off the ground that Gary's eating, he ends up finding it very hard to get rid of, desperately trying to scrape it off on the walls or in the trash. This ends up with SpongeBob being hospitalized and a terrible pandemic breaking out in Bikini Bottom, eventually cured by Mr. Krabs setting up a booth for Gary to eat the fungus off of everyone that's contracted it. In this horror-esque episode from Season 4, SpongeBob experiences a mental breakdown after being overworked when the Krusty Krab becomes a 24-hour business, part of an elaborate plan by Plankton to obtain the secret formula from an exhausted SpongeBob. Of course, this doesn't ultimately work, and simply causes SpongeBob to become afflicted with a terrible phobia of Krabby Patties. Maybe weirdest of all is that SpongeBob eventually gets cured of his Krabby Patty phobia when a giant Krabby Patty bursts into his room to give him a glass of chocolate milk, revealing itself as friendly. Another bizarre moment takes place in a different episode where Mr. Krabs decides to keep the Krusty Krab open 24 hours a day. In the Season 2 episode, Graveyard Shift, SpongeBob and Squidward are terrified together working an overnight shift at the Krusty Krab when they see a dark figure wielding a spatula appear in the window and the lights begin to flicker. When the figure steps into the light, however, it ends up being an innocent, regular guy looking for a job. When Squidward points out that this doesn't explain the flickering lights, however, they look around in horror to find the grainy black and white image of the classic cinema vampire Nosferatu looking back at them. Maybe the weirdest moment between Squidward and SpongeBob is when Squidward finds that SpongeBob is so obsessed with him that he has a room dedicated to copies of all 492 of his self-portraits. Squidward stumbles across this in the Season 6 episode Squid's Visit, when he comes to retrieve a vacuum cleaner that he's lent SpongeBob from his house, and effectively gets trapped there by the all-too-obsessive SpongeBob. At no other moment in the show do we get a look at just how absurdly far SpongeBob's obsession goes than when Squidward happens across the nearly 500 portraits he's made of him. Of course, SpongeBob's annoying antics drive Squidward out of his mind, but the Season 2 episode Squidville includes maybe the weirdest length that he goes to in order to avoid SpongeBob. After seeing an advertisement for it, Squidward moves to a place called Tentacle Acres, a private community just for those as desperate to move as he is. After confirming via intercom that he is neither a sponge nor a starfish, Squidward is led into a community of his doppelgangers, complete with everything he's ever wanted, including canned bread, but he quickly gets bored of his perfect life without SpongeBob. If the super bizarre sight of a town of Squidwards isn't weird enough, the fact that this experience makes him miss SpongeBob sure is. It's hard to pin down just 25 weird moments for a show as truly bizarre as SpongeBob SquarePants, and this list could really go on and on. Which of these moments was the weirdest in your opinion? Can you think of any other especially wacky moments from the show that we missed here? Let us know in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe to Screen Rant for more great content. Thanks for watching.